Hi, good evening to everyone. Welcome again to the Never Again Live show. I'm Mayor Weinstein and I'm joined with Mayor Jolowitz. Tonight, we're going to be discussing Israel. Is it a Jewish state or is it a state of Jews? There is a difference. In fact, our rabbi would often ask the same question, and we're going to be asking this question today because it really goes to the heart of. There's protests going on in Israel to call for new elections and to demonize the prime minister right now, Netanyahu. Do they want a Jewish state or do they want something else? And we're going to get into the whole issue tonight. And as we get into the issue, it's this whole idea: are we for a Jewish state or not for a Jewish state? And what are we for? Um, the question demands an answer from Jewish leadership also in diaspora. What are they fighting for? What do they articulate? Who represents Jews in diaspora? We'll talk about that tonight. Mayor, how are you tonight?
Well, I'll answer the way that I do every time we get to the mayor. It's a pleasure to be with you, but it's unfortunate the discussion that we end up having, given the circumstances of what we see in Israel and with its neighbors.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Israel's surrounded by on all fronts from enemies that want to destroy Israel. And at the same time, we have internal turmoil. We have the Haredim that are saying, some are saying that they'd rather leave the country than enlist in the army. What are the issues there? What's going on there? What's the discussion all about? We also have on the far left, they want Arabs to come in from Gaza and work in Israel, and Arabs from Judea and Samaria, what they call the West Bank, to come into Israel proper and work. And these are people who have been educated from birth that Israel must be destroyed. They celebrated the October 7th slaughter of Israelis. What's going on in Israel? Why can't there be unity? And let me also point out that last week we read in Shul Parsha Shalach, which was the Parsha dealing with the spies that went to Moses sent them to look at the land of Israel and bring back a report. Not only did they not really bring back a report, but a spy is supposed to come back to those who sent them and give those leaders the report and let them decide what to do after they have the information. What did they do? They stood in front of the people and they brought fear to the people. This week, moving forward, it's Parshas Korach. And that was someone by the name of Korach that instigated an outright rebellion against Moses. And it's so pertinent to today of what we're discussing right now. Mary, you see the issues going on. You see the division that's going on in Israel. You even see in the army with the generals that there was a report that just came out in the New York Times that they are saying we should end the war. We should allow Hamas to once again govern Gaza. What's going on here, Mayor?
Well, if I was to give title to what I at least will contribute to today's discussion, it'll be that the only lessons of history are that there are no lessons to be learned from history. I think it was Hegel who first said it. I know Rabbi Kahana had often repeated that same sentiment. It seems that we never learn the lessons of history of yesteryear. We keep making the same mistake. The quiet rebellion that's happening in the army, for example, you have Israel's senior high command, which was to a certain degree responsible for this debacle of October 7th, an intelligence and a military failure. And these are the same people, these are the same generals who are prosecuting the war against an enemy which made quite clear its intentions on October 7th. They haven't been replaced. But worse than that is that the philosophy which guided them hasn't been replaced. These people still believe in Oslo. They still believe that there are certain buttons that one might push, and if you push those right buttons, you can get so-called friends from around the world to support Israel. And history's shown us that not to be the case. I will, as we proceed, I lecture regularly, and I often bring in the lessons not learned. And one can go back, of course, before the creation of the State of Israel. The fact that the Arabs living in the land of Israel never wanted Israel to exist. They were butchering Jews before there was a State of Israel. So one can't argue that it's about territories. That notion needs to be put to rest. We see, of course, that every time that a war is won by Israel, the conditions for somehow having some measure of peace with the Arab neighbors is that Israel has to give and the Arabs get. It's all about concessions. I'm going to talk, if you don't mind, a little later about the fraudulent peace process, which goes on and on. And even when there are those people or those elements or those parties or those movements in Israel that understand that the peace process isn't improbable, it's impossible, nonetheless, Israel continues to play the game, trying to show the world, look, we're willing to give as long as these enemies that surround us are going to recognize our right to exist, as if that is the holy grail that we want, for them to recognize our right to exist. We don't need them to recognize our right to exist. We need to do what we need to do. And I will address that issue. But in Israel, and I never thought a few years ago that I would ever be as blunt as what I am about to say. We've seen it in America, and it's certainly true in Israel. There is a deep state element. There is a deep state element in Israel, as we have seen in America. If one goes back and looks at what we've learned in America, going back to the days when Trump announced his candidacy, we look at the election of 2016, and we find out more and more with each passing month that the deep state, which included the FBI, the CIA, and other intelligence services, were heavily vested in one candidate over another, one ideology over another, to the point where they were being lawless in what they were doing. In Israel, you mentioned the general. We've seen the courts have done this for a long time. We see all of a sudden that the Supreme Court in Israel is deciding which military operations Israel can undertake, which they consider to be legitimate or not legitimate. The Supreme Court decides that there are too many Arabs who are being held as prisoners in Israel, and then they need to be released. It's insanity. We'll talk about the details, but I was referring to, by example, the fact that it was just revealed a few days ago that there are quite a number of Arab terrorists who are being quietly released from Israel because it creates a backlog. There are too many of them in prison. Well, the reason that there are too many of them in prison is because there are too many of them who want to kill Jews. It's remarkable. It's like a revolving door. We've also seen the news story with a fellow who was in charge of the Arab hospital, which Shifa, which was the one which was home to the Hamas command, its tunnels and everything else. He was arrested because of his active participation in terrorism, his active support of Hamas, his active efforts to hide Hamas terrorists in the hospital. He was arrested in November, and Israel released him just 2 days ago. They released him, and it was quietly done. And the only reason that we know that he was released was because he immediately began to propagate an anti-Israel pro-Hamas line, saying that October 7th needs to be done again. And all of a sudden, we find out behind the scenes are a lot of very ugly things. And the position that I find myself in, and I know you as well, is that we are trying to fight and speak on behalf of and advocate for a state of Israel that we love so much. And yet, when we take a closer look and we see what the state of Israel allows to be done to itself, it's quite disheartening. And when we criticize it, we become the naysayers. We don't want peace. It's terrible. And if one is to choose between the option of not criticizing those things that Israel does, which is injurious to its own future, and criticizing it, I think we've both shown that we will stand on the side of we will do whatever we need to do in criticizing the very nation that we love in order to make sure that it not misstep again, because there are too many dead Jews who lie victim to those missteps.
Right. Mayor, can you explain to the viewers the difference between a Jewish state and a state of Jews in the most simplistic way, the basic
Yeah.
way?
In the most simplistic way, if one looked at Israel's Declaration of Independence, I remind the audience, by now the audience knows, Israel doesn't have a constitution. So there's no codified law. There are a number of, there are a number of municipal laws and regional laws and national laws, but there isn't a constitution. The Declaration of Independence basically said that Israel is established as a Jewish state with rights accorded to all citizens of Israel. Now, it's remarkable. I'm going to jump ahead to October of 1995. October 5th, 1995, which was exactly 1 month before Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated, he gave a speech at the Knesset. It was the last speech that he gave at the Knesset, and when he was assassinated, everybody talked about the fact that he was this prophet of peace, that he wanted so much to have peace with the Arab neighbors after all of Oslo that he was part of. And they talk about the fact that had he not been assassinated, there would have been peace with our Arab neighbors. It's fraudulent redefinition or rereading or revisionist view of what was actually said in that last speech that he gave. In that speech, he talked about the fact that yes, Israel believed that there should be some kind of Palestinian Arab entity, but it would have limitations. Statehood was not one of the things that he agreed upon, even though a lot of people speak in his name, suggesting that it was. Even though he didn't believe in the concept of a Jewish state the way that we speak of it, he did understand that Israel was meant to be a Jewish state with a Jewish majority. It's one of the things that he mentioned in that last speech. He also talked about the fact, and he was referencing actually the Declaration of Independence that I speak about. He was talking about the fact that Israel's minorities, the Arabs and others, would be entitled to their rights. And they talked about social rights, they talked about economic rights, they talked about human rights. He talked about the rights, the civil rights that Israel's minorities would be entitled to as defined by law in Israel. He was quite clear and quite obvious in omitting one particular thing which Israel's left today refuses to talk about. He omitted the fact that they would be entitled to full political rights, which would allow the Arabs, assuming that the birth rate went one way, what have you, over a course of several generations, to become a majority in Israel. They would deny the political rights. So even Yitzhak Rabin, who is considered today, in the aftermath of his death, to be this dove among doves, which is sort of nonsense, to have suggested that there should be two states. He never did. So let me go back to the Declaration of Independence. That Declaration of Independence, Rabbi Kahana used to say, was a schizophrenic document, because it said that Israel would be created as a Jewish state, and then it says with rights to all its minorities. And the rabbi used to point out, at the time, for him, during his time, the demographic bomb was a much greater concern than it is today. There was the concern of what happens if demographically the Arabs, by virtue not of bullets but rather of babies, have children enough that they become a majority, and through the democratic process decide that they wanted to elect a number of people to the Knesset, enough that they could command legislation, And it's interesting that the rabbi used to always opine by saying that whereas it takes 61 mandates out of the 120 to govern in Israel, because it is such a complicated country, you wouldn't need 61 Arabs sitting in the Knesset. You would need 50 some. You'd only need 50 some, because you'd always find the balance of the leftists, the Jews, who would vote with them. I mean, it was a sarcastic but very true comment that he made. But the point that he was making was, you have to decide: is Israel going to be a Zionist nation, which presupposes a Jewish majority based on Jewish principles? That would presuppose a Jewish state. Or would it be a state of Jews, as you've asked, which would mean that the Jews would simply be citizens of he would call it kiddingly always a Hebrew-speaking Portugal, is what he often referred to it as.
Right.
But just a nation of people where the Jews would live, but wouldn't have religious title to claim that Israel is the one Jewish state. Let the Arabs have as many Muslim states as they want. Israel would remain the Jewish state. And therein lies that conflict between, is Israel destined to be a Jewish state in character with the Jewish religion as the religion of the state? Nothing to be apologetic about. Church of England is actually, the Church of England is actually still the church in England. And obviously, every Muslim nation has the Quran, has Islam as their national religion. Good luck to them. But Israel is a Jewish state. So it's a state that was meant to be Jewish by character, by definition, as opposed to just a state which had Jews living in it. And that's the quarrel that seems to still be extant between the political ideologies. The left, which obviously is almost exclusively secular, doesn't believe that Israel necessarily needs to be a Jewish state. In fact, they quite often argue that it ought not to be a Jewish state. It's the left. They were described as the post-Zionists going back almost 25, 28 years ago. They were the ones who said that Zionism had basically fulfilled its mission. Its mission was to create the state of Israel. And once created, there was no need for Israel to continue to be a Zionist state. Well, obviously, those people on the other side of the political divide, those who are conservative, those who are religious, those who are the Zionists, they're the ones who said, no, Israel is meant to be only a Jewish state. Unlike some of the thinking that took place even before Israel was created, Argentina would not have been a good substitute for the land of Israel, nor would Uganda have been a substitute. It was only in Israel. It was in Israel because it was Jewish, and that is where Judaism was born, and that is where Judaism will continue to thrive. The left just doesn't see it that way. And we've got this redefinition of what Israel was meant to be, tragically.
If Israel was to if you had enough sway in the Knesset, a serious coalition made between, well, now there's Meretz joining with Labor. So if you had the left together with the Arab parties and maybe some others, it would form a sizable bloc. And they would want to have, as the first thing, to say, annul the law of return for Jews. They would want to do that as one of the first steps. And bring in immigration, they'll call it family reunification. More Muslims moving into Israel proper. And to sway the demographics in Israel. Now, the left is running away from this idea of Israel as a Jewish state. But what we have witnessed in Western countries is that there is waves of Islamic immigration to these countries. And the majority of Islamic leadership in these Western countries, they bring in speakers who advocate that they would want to impose eventually, Sharia law in these Western countries. So the left in Israel is turning a blind eye to that reality that's going on globally, the call for Sharia law. You have a person rising in the polls in the elections in France, Marie Le Pen, that understands the threat in France, and she takes it very seriously. And she's talking about expelling that Islamic threat that there is there. You have leaders in Europe that are talking about forming a union with other various European leaders to address this issue, the same way that Geert Wilders is addressing this issue in the Netherlands. But somehow, the left wing in Israel doesn't want to believe this at all.
Yeah.
What is it with the left in Israel? And you have many Jewish leaders in diaspora that don't want to entertain this, don't want to think about this, and want to call anyone that talks about it an avowed racist.
Yeah. Let me connect some of those dots that you bring up.
You can't even put it under the headline of Jewish survival.
Yeah.
Like they got the daggers out for you.
Yeah. Let me connect those dots. As far as Europe is concerned, there are some very credible voices, analysts of what has already happened in the last 15 to 20 years in Europe that will tell you, based on trends and demographic numbers, that Europe has already fallen. And when I say fallen, in other words, the table has already been set. And with certain countries in Europe, Belgium, parts of Sweden, and everything else, you're talking about the fact that the forecast for the year 2040 or 2050, to be certain, there are quite a number of European countries which will be under Islamic domain. There's no stopping it, because we're talking about the number of children who run around in Belgium or in Netherlands or in the France whose first name is Mohammed. It's a done deal. While some of these countries are producing babies at the rate of 1.6%, some of them, the Muslims living in these countries, are producing them at the point of 4.6 per family. And it's a done deal. Why Israel doesn't notice is because it goes back to what I was saying about the lessons not learned. There's so many things that Israel just doesn't learn. And part of the reason is because Israel continues to believe that if it does the right thing, and Israel always does try to do the right thing, that somehow the world will come to recognize that we are the good guys, the others are the bad guys, and therefore the world will be empathetic, not just sympathetic to the Jews as they were post Auschwitz, but they will be empathetic to the Jewish cause, because the Jews are a people who dwell among the nations, are perpetual victims as they are.
Let me add something quickly to what you just said about, we hope that the world will eventually understand all that. So today, I posted this on Twitter. I'm not the only one, and it was going viral. In a school in the UK, a Jewish boy, 12 years old, public school, was asked a question by his teacher for his perspective on the war going on between Israel and Hamas. And he answered, and he says he would like Hamas, which is listed in the UK as a terrorist organization, he would like to see Hamas wiped out. The police in the UK, from the highest levels, are conducting an investigation on the kid. So as far as world opinion, we're waiting for them. It has been shifting because the idea of justice and what they stand for in Western values, that has been changing as a result of this Islamic immigration. Go ahead, Mayor.
Yeah. Well, I was just reaching as you were speaking because I wanted to find the fellow's name. Forget Europe. In Israel, a state attorney, I'm trying to read my scribbled handwriting because the story came across today. Amit Isman, I believe, has called for an investigation in Israel of Itamar Ben-Gvir, because Itamar Ben-Gvir's comments have been, and I'm going to read, he's being, he wants to be investigated. I'm looking at my notes because suspicion of incitement against the residents of Gaza.
Oh,
Now imagine this is an Israeli state attorney representing the whole judicial nightmare that Israel has faced, the one that we were talking about prior to October 7th, and he wants to bring a special investigation, suspicion of incitement against the residents of Gaza. We live in the twilight zone. This is mind-boggling. It is mind-boggling. The fact that one could even suggest this much. And if you told this to someone a while, they would say, okay, this isn't real. Well, it's very real. And when we talk about, you were talking about demographics and numbers and everything else, it's interesting. There are a number of people, I saw a survey that came out yesterday that said that the number of people, Arabs, Palestinian Arabs, who want to leave Gaza is a significant number, as if it's to suggest that it's good news. Oh, they might decide to get up and leave. They're not getting up to leave. That is a false hope. In fact, let me give some numbers. 3 days ago, Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, came out and demanded that the Western world and expected the Biden-Blinken administration. Blinken is the one who runs American foreign policy. Biden doesn't realize that America has foreign policy. He basically came out and said that he, representing the Palestinian Authority, expects Israel to be pressured to accept UN Resolution 194. 194 goes to, it was before you were born, my friend, Mayor. Resolution 194, which basically was the repatriation of Arab refugees. Now, we know because of UNRWA and all that the Arab refugees, they never ceased to be. The children of refugees remained refugees, and their children and theirs and theirs. There are many people living in the Western world in Dearborn, Michigan, who are the great grandchildren of Arabs who might have lived in that area in 1947 and 1948, who were considered Palestinian refugees, even though not only were they born in the Western world, their grandparents were born in the Western world, but they're considered refugees. I want to get to the point. And the Arabs have insisted, and the United Nations supports them in this, that Resolution 194 can be considered for the repatriation of Arabs to Israel proper, which of course was a demographic bomb. Now, what's the number of refugees in Israel historically actually recognizes as people who truly do live in a refugee status anywhere in the Middle East, who were once tied to Israel at the time of its modern day establishment as a state. The number that Israel has given is 30,000. 30,000 Arabs who might be able to claim the status of refugee as it was meant to be defined. The figure that the Arabs gave, that UNRWA gave, and the Arabs raised it exponentially whenever they want. Last year, the figure that was given by the Arabs, recognized much by the United Nations, was 5.4 million. 5.4 million need to be repatriated, which was interesting because a few months later, the Palestinian Authority came out with a position paper in which they said, oops, not 5.4 million, 6 million, which is a very convenient number for them to have manufactured, and not accidentally. And even more remarkable was one of the scholars, and I put that in air quotes, one of the scholars from Birzeit University came out and said, what's 6 million? There are 8 million Arab refugees. So for the repatriation of these, all they've got to do is go back, bring their keys, go back and reclaim their homes in Israel. And oh my God, democracy suggests that they can vote Israel out of existence. This is insanity. It's insanity that we even allow the discussion to be held. It all leads to the two-state solution. But I always, every time I join you, we talk about the two-state solution. I want to remind people that behind the scenes, the two-state solution has already proven that it will not work, that it cannot work, and so on and so forth. But people forget that behind the scenes, there was a very legitimate academic exercise that was being performed Edward Said, for those of them who, I mean, for those of you who remember Edward Said, the bear I take spoke professor of English literature, spoke English beautifully, spoke English better than than any American speaks English. Uh, it is positioned at Columbia, how ironic, Columbia University, and
Yeah.
Edward Said came up with something which was quite clever. He said, and we're going back 20 years, 25. Well, we don't believe in the two-state solution because we don't think that the two ideological opponents can actually come to terms. Let's do it another way, he suggested, the one-state solution. And the one-state solution would be an Israel slash Palestine or Palestine slash Israel, one nation, same territory. And given the birth rate, especially at the time when he propagated this concept, and he wasn't the only one, the concept was we'll get Jews and Arabs together, we'll get Israelis and Arabs together,
Yep.
and we will allow democracy to rule. And given the fact that it was quite evident that the Arabs, given the birth rate, were going to be the ones who were going to prevail, let them vote as to whether or not it should be in Israel or Palestine. That was, and that one state solution, by the way, that notion has not yet been put to rest. You have you have buffoons, clowns, and very dangerous buffoons like Peter Beinart, who basically come out and change their support of the two-state solution and are basically calling for some kind of confederation of an Israel-Palestine. The same thing that Edward Said had suggested. Edward Said knew exactly what it was meant to lead to, and so did Peter Beinart. Peter Beinart isn't the idiot, even though he is. He's not the idiot. The people who give Peter Beinart a platform, who invite him to speak to the organizations, who follow him and his writings, these are the idiots. These are the useful idiots who would be the end of us. These people have to be marginalized. They have to be exposed for what they are, and Israel needs to move on. What Israel needs to stop to do, and I mentioned it, if you don't mind, if it's an appropriate time, I want to bring up something that I was going to talk about.
Please.
It was about lessons not learned. And the two-state solution, for example, the discussion of a two-state solution, a Jewish state and an Arab state. But it's not really an Arab state because the Arabs have 21 Arab states. The two-state solution is fraudulent in suggesting it would be an Israeli state and a Palestinian state. The conflict has been redefined as Israeli-Palestinian, what used to be Israeli-Arab. And it was done by design because Israel, of course, has become the Goliath and the Palestinians have become the David to Israel's skill. Anyhow, I just want to bring something up. I often lecture about the fraudulent peace process. I have become, unfortunately, too much of an expert on every aspect of it. And we talk about the fact that how is it that the Jews, so brilliant enough to have been awarded 26% of all the Nobel laureates since its inception, somehow when it comes to matters of survival, self-survival, simply don't get it. And they keep talking about the peace process as if it's some viable solution for a conflict between a people that wants to live in a civil manner in its own Jewish state and the savages that surround Israel who don't think that Israel has a right to exist. A right to exist. And it should be understood, by the way, when people bring up Egypt and Jordan, well, Egypt and Jordan both have peace treaties with Israel. They don't recognize Israel's right to exist. They recognize the fact de facto that Israel exists in fact. And of course, we've seen Egypt exposed post October 7th, something that Israeli intelligence either knew about and didn't publicize well enough for us to have taken a position, or the Israeli intelligence missed the mark as to how pro-Hamas Egypt really was, and the money that is made by the Egyptian government and Sisi's son. But let me get to the point that I want to make. I gave a lecture last year in which I was talking about the various peace processes, not between Israel and the Arab states that surround it, but between Israel and the Palestinian Arabs. And I identified 17 official peace processes that took place, mostly endorsed by the Western world. And I listed them, and it showed time after time after time after time how fraudulent they were. That the Arab intention was not to arrive at a situation where there would be two states, a Jewish state and an Arab state. The Arab intention was that there not be a Jewish state. The Arabs were more concerned about Israel not being a Jewish state than getting a state of their own. And we've spoken about that before when we talked about the fact that Egypt was in control of Gaza for the 19 years between 48 and 67, that Jordan was in control of the West Bank, Judea, and Samaria for those same 19 years. There was no effort made whatsoever at any international body to speak about the creation of a Palestinian state. But I want to get to it. I'm just glancing at the notes because there are 17 different committees, 17 different peace processes that were undertaken. I'll mention only 4 or 5 of the big ones that people remember, and we'll say what happened to that. Forget the minor ones, which came and went before people even learned their names. We began, of course, in 1991 with Madrid. 1991 Madrid was even before, mind you, that was even before Israel went to Camp David and the Oslo, the fraudulent peace on Clinton's White House lawn. Anyhow, we had Madrid in 91, Oslo in 93, we had the Wye River Memorandum in 98, we had Camp David Summit in 2000, we had the Taba Summit in 2001, we had the roadmap, I'm skipping even a few. There are a few minor ones that no one had ever heard of, but nonetheless, they were official attempts to have a peace process. There was Taba, there was the roadmap in 2003, and it's interesting, I'll pause for a second, the roadmap was actually something which is formulated after something which George Bush, Bush, had basically said that there should be a two-state solution as long as the Arabs were friendly to it. And they went on and on. So I'm going to pull out, and I get to do this exercise in the last 2 minutes and nothing more. And it'll show you that we who love Israel, we who advocate for Israel, and those who are indeed Israeli spokesmen are completely oblivious to the pitfalls of a fraudulent peace treaty. Because we always want blamed for its lack of success. In the year 2005, in fact, it was on February 8th, there was a peace process which was official. It was endorsed by the world. There was the Sharm el-Sheikh summit. It was the Sharm el-Sheikh summit. It was held in 2005 with one intention. The intention of that summit was to bring the second intifada to an end. The second intifada from 2000 to 2005, which saw over 1,000 Israelis killed, murdered by terrorists. So Sharm el-Sheikh, they have a summit, and who attends that? We have Ariel Sharon attending for Israel, representing Israel, and then we had representing the Arab camp. We had Mahmoud Abbas, we had Jordan, and we had Egypt. Jordan was King Hussein, Egypt was Mubarak. So these 4 people get together in order to come up with an end to the Intifada. I'm going to read you the language of that agreement. The summit was designed, I'm quoting, to cease all violence against each other's peoples. How fraudulent for an Israeli spokesman, an Israeli prime minister, to allow a peace agreement gathering to say we call for a cease to all violence against each other's people, as if that this is a mutual equivalence. And
Right.
This is our fault, this mutual equivalence. So part of what was decided with this Sharm el-Sheikh thing was that Israel was going to release 900 terrorists as a gesture of goodwill. The Arabs are going to stop their terrorism, and Israel would rely on the roadmap which I mentioned, which was formulated less than 2 years before in 2003. Okay, the roadmap which was endorsed by the quartet. The quartet, once again, we're talking about the United States, Russia, okay, European Union. I mean, this is in the United Nations. That was the quartet. And we were supposed to say, oh, good, there's going to be an effort to establish a peace in the Middle East. Israel released 500 terrorists. This is the meeting was held on February 8th. In May, Israel takes stock of what's going on. The number of suicide bombings had gone down, but the acts of terrorism had not dissipated, had not been lessened. And so Sharon comes out and says, we're the only ones upholding the agreement. We've already released 500 terrorists. We will not release the other 400. And the Arabs continue to murder Jews. Now, this was in May of 2005. So you would think that the Israelis, Sharon, would say, wow, this is incredible. We did what we needed to do, but the Arabs continued to murder us. It was a fraud. The peace is a fraud. Instead, what does Israel do? It announces the unilateral disengagement of August 2005, a few months later. Not having learned the lesson that was thrown right in their face, Israel says, we know what we're going to do. We're going to withdraw unilaterally from Gaza. Not only will we withdraw from Gaza unilaterally, we will dismantle 21 Jewish communities in Gaza and 4 others in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, part of the agreement. There is no question that the Western world will come to recognize that we are noble in our attempts. The burden now is on our enemies to prove that they want peace as much as we do. And we saw what happened. And because time is running, I will simply say what happened is a result of the unilateral disengagement of August 2005. And I will fast forward very quickly. Yeah. October 7th, 2023 is what happened. Never mind the operation that Israel had to go into Gaza 2008/9, 2012, 2014, 2021. In each case, because rockets were launched into Israel from the disengaged Gaza, and in each case, Israel made the same mistake, proving once again that Israel never learns the lessons of yesteryear. Ceasefire, 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 and ceasefire. There were 4 consecutive ceasefires, and each was followed by rearming on the part of the Arab enemies, only to strike much stronger the next time around. And today, as you mentioned in the opening, Mayor, you have members of Israel's senior command, generals, who basically saying, enough, it's time for Israel to get out of Gaza, even, and they stipulated, even if it means Hamas remaining in power. Once again, we do this every time, and Gary has a graphic, we have met the enemy, and he is us. Or, as I often quote on this podcast that I do with you, there it is, thank you.
There it is.
Or as I mentioned, which was the Eric Hoffer comment, we lie the loudest when we lie to ourselves. We are a pitiful, pitiful nation that simply thinks that if the right buttons are pushed, somehow that world which is indifferent to our suffering will somehow recognize that we're the good guys. My God, if October 7th and the 8 months that have followed haven't taught us that that is not the case, then George Orwell had a great phrase. George Orwell in his time spoke about the inability of the West. He referred to it as, it's a magnificent turn of a phrase, a generation of unteachables. A generation of unteachables.
Let me chime in for 1 minute, because and this is going to be my 1 minute of chiming in. When we're defining a Jewish state versus a state of Jews, we need to keep something in mind, which nobody has overlooked because it's natural to us. To be a Jewish state, if you listen to Kahane or Cook or any other great rabbis, part of it is we don't have a constitution because we have a Torah and we have a Talmud. And that has to factor in to the government of Israel somehow. And your comments about we're not stopping in Gaza. Well, I mean, the Talmud says that if someone plans to kill you, get up and kill him first. That's Hamas. I mean, it's in the Talmud, it's in the Torah. So I'm going to chime out now, but I want to just add that for you guys to add to the discussion, that if you're talking about a Jewish state, somewhere in the government, somebody has to be aware that there's a document called the Torah, and we have to also fall back on that occasionally instead of a constitution. If you think about English law, American law, Western law, it's all really, you go back far enough, it's really based on the Torah. So that's my 2 cents for now. I'm going to put you guys back on with one quick graphic, which I thought was, I put on earlier. But if you look at what Rabbi Cook said back in very early in the whole concept of religious Zionism, that the land of Israel is not an external acquisition of the nation, but rather that it is bonded to the Jewish people and to the Torah as one unified whole. So I think we need to keep that in mind. And my last comment on this topic is in agreement with this concept, is 2 other comments. One is that if someone comes to kill you, rise up early and kill him first. And again, that's why we can't leave Gaza, because they're telling us if we leave Hamas, they're going to kill us. And of course, the final comment is that Rabbi Kahane made it very clear that it's the illusion of the world reality of the Torah. So again, not that that governs modern Jewish life except for ultra-Orthodox. However, it governs all of us to some degree. Do not forget, we don't need a constitution. We've got the Torah and we've got the Talmud. Guys, back to you, and I'll see you at the end of the show.
Your comment, Gary, you said you're going to give us your 2 cents worth. It's a lot more than 2 cents. It's everything. But the reason I deliberately went to Yitzhak Rabin earlier, because it isn't just a Jewish concept. Even Yitzhak Rabin, who wasn't religious, even he understood that in order for Israel to survive and to be sustained as a Jewish state, there had to be a Jewish majority. Even the non-religious Rabin understood it enough that that was the nature of his last speech, as I said, on October 5th of 1995. Even he understood that. Even he understood that. Today, that is lost. It's lost.
No, that's right. The division is, I mean, it's got to be repaired. If October 7th didn't wake up everyone that we have to get our act together seriously together. I mean, just with the Haredim, that issue, that's a huge issue. Let's leave, but let's leave the country instead of serving. Well, how about let's discuss what is the problem? Maybe there's some problems for ultra-Orthodox Jews in enlisting in the military. Maybe there could be some accommodation made that would address what their concerns with that is. We have to be on the same page. The left wing, they're delusional. You can't understand when they say, the Islamics, they say, we want Sharia law to rule everywhere that we touch, and they believe Israel, all of it belongs to them. They chant from the river to the sea. They make it clear when they're on Har Bayit, when they say, this is all to do with Al-Aqsa. They call it the Al-Aqsa flood on October 7th. And they preach it's all theirs. Hamas is right. Jihad, Intifada, Kaibar, Yehud. They all say that. So, but the left, they don't want us to believe it, or they. Thank God that there is social media that Elon Musk took over Twitter. That we can get the word out, we can get the information out. I had an incident today that I shared some information that University of Toronto, there's an encampment there by a pro-Hamas gang, and there's a ruling by the Supreme Court finally that they said that U of T can enforce the law now and call on the police by tomorrow, Wednesday, to remove the pro-Hamas illegal dwellers at the so-called encampment. So I went on to their Instagram page, and sure enough, there's all kinds of comments on the latest, what's going on. In fact, they're saying we should take up arms and go against, target the Zionists in Toronto. And so I post that information on Facebook. All of a sudden I get a warning, like 20 minutes later, we had to remove that post. I'm just exposing what's going on. We had to remove that post. and you might face certain restrictions. Yeah, the hell with Facebook, Instagram, and all that. But thank God we do have the mechanism with Twitter to get the word out. And Itamar Ben-Gvir, he was very successful prior to the election that he could get the word out on Twitter and get the attention of a lot of people. So the problems are there, but we have to get the information out there.
What we need to do is have the Iroquois Indian gather and demonstrate and tell the Palestinian, the pro-Hamas people, to stop demonstrating on Iroquois land.
Yeah.
If you don't mind, as often I do when we get close to the end of your podcast, I normally find what I consider to be an appropriate take some of the things we're talking about. When both of us had made reference to the generals who seem to have lost the resolve or even the understanding of why the fight needs to be won in Gaza, behind the scenes, the explanation that was given by the generals was that Israel really doesn't have all the armaments necessary to prosecute the war in Gaza the way it ought to be prosecuted. And if Israel was ultimately going to fight in the north with Hezbollah, then it had to be very careful not to spend its arsenal in Gaza. Now, the remarkable thing is that comment seems to miss a very important point, that it was the senior command of Israel's IDF that for quite a number of years were the ones who thought that Israel could downsize both the size of the army and its armament. You were the guys who said it was okay. You were the guys who said we can fight the war, a cyber war. You were the guys who went along with Ehud Barak and Ehud Olmert. You were the ones who went along with Gadi Eisenkot. You were the ones who went along with Moshe Ya'alon, who said, and with Benny Gantz, who said, let's cut 1,000 tanks and let's cut another 600 tanks. You were the ones who said the Americans will always be for us, will always be there for us when we need them. They were the ones, the experts, the professionals in the military game who told us what needed to be done then. And today, we're supposed to somehow back off because they were wrong, even though they don't admit that they were. But I want to come back to something that I just wanted to say. And that is that I was talking about the lessons not learned and so on and so forth. Benjamin Netanyahu was the prime minister of Israel. Benjamin Netanyahu will continue to be the prime minister of Israel until sometime in November of 2026. The only way that that's not going to happen is if some of the rioters that the police have allowed to encroach on his front yard get to him. And I say sort of tongue in cheek. But if the coalition that he has 64 seats with the collapses, whether it's the Haredim or Itamar Ben-Gvir upset that Israel was going to stop its war in Gaza, it's the only way that the government will cease its existence short. I'm talking about the coalition government short of November 2026. Otherwise, there's nothing the left can do. They can protest, they can scream, they can cry, they can do whatever they want to do. They can plot behind his back. They can continue with the deep state that does in fact exist. But even Netanyahu himself is to blame. And I won't go into the details that we've referenced before. The fact that he's allowed Qatari money, $30 million a month, to come in because we thought that by having a somewhat more affluent Gaza, that all of a sudden that they would be preoccupied with living better than they had ever lived before and not attack Israel. Benjamin Netanyahu, who's a very smart man, is an expert when it comes to Winston Churchill. He knows Winston Churchill. He knows Winston Churchill, the force of one man who stood and did the right thing at the right time. It goes back to that the great man theory, that debate between Thomas Carlyle and Herbert Spencer. Does man make history or does history make a man? And I'm guessing that Bibi Netanyahu will say that in this particular case, World War II, the circumstances are there, but it was a great man. I want to quote something. I want to read you something, please. The audience has probably heard this before. It was a speech given by Winston Churchill in 1935. Winston Churchill in 1935 was speaking before the House of Commons, and he was warned. This is in 1935, and he was warning Britain about the impending tragedy that was going to befall Europe if the British didn't respond to what appeared to be the beginning of a military buildup on the part of the Germans. Anyhow, there's a famous passage of a speech that he gave. It's quoted often by his biographer at the time, Martin, not at the time, his biographer later, Martin Gilbert. And Martin Gilbert mentioned, he wrote of this in The Prophet of Truth, the book. And Bibi Netanyahu sees this as one of his favorites. He would, when he would give lectures or speeches, he would somehow find room to say what I'm about to read to you. He would quote it. And the question I would ask when I complete, it's 3 very short paragraphs, is, has Bibi Netanyahu lived up to what Winston Churchill was speaking about? And I think that the jury's no longer out. The answer was no, he failed. This is what Churchill said in 1935. When the situation was manageable, and mind you, I want you to relate this to Israel. And I don't mean just Israel today, Israel a year ago, Israel 5 years ago, Israel 15 years ago. This is what he said. When I say 15 years ago, I'm going back during Bibi Netanyahu's reign as prime minister. This is what Churchill said in 35. When the situation was manageable, it was neglected. And now that it's thoroughly out of hand, we apply too late the remedies which might then have effected a cure. There is nothing new in the story. It falls into that long, dismal catalog of the fruitlessness of experience and the confirmed unteachability of mankind. Want of foresight, unwillingness to act when action would be simple and effective, lack of clear thinking, confusion of counsel until the emergency comes, until self-preservation strikes its jarring gong. These are the features which constitute the endless repetition of history. Translation: God help us if we refuse to learn the very obvious lessons of history.
100%. 100%. There's no question about it.
Yeah.
Look at the challenge right now. There's no question about it.
Anyhow, I let Winston Churchill do my closing for me, Mayor. I only wish that Bibi would pick up one of his books where he indeed quoted this very thing, as that the real leaders of the world are the ones who understand what needs to be done before it's too late.
Right.
Yeah.
No, 100%.
A lesson not learned in Jerusalem.
Listen, 100%. We're at that period of time right now. Decisions have to be made.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean,
Terrible.
the recommendations to leave Hamas in power in Gaza, the declaration by Netanyahu and many others when the war started that we're not only going to defeat Hamas, we're going to end Hamas completely, and letting them remain to rebuild, regroup, pull out, let those tunnels still, arms will be flowing in, weapons will be flowing in from Egypt again. It will take some time, but it will happen.
And add to that, Mayor, what I said earlier, that this Amit Isman, an Israeli state attorney who's called for an investigation of Itamar Ben-Gvir, what, for suspicion of incitement against the residents of Gaza. By the way, there's something that I want to mention, and every time I'm on with you, I've mentioned it once before, but it should be mentioned every single time.
Yep.
That there's a terrible, terrible and fraudulent comment that's made by supporters of Israel, by its so-called friends and the few still friends that it really has. And the comment that's always made is that the Palestinian Arabs and Hamas attacked Israel in an unprovoked war. That's the comment that's made by every philo-Semite. It's made by every good person who believes in Israel, the Douglas Murrays and the others, that the Arabs attacked, it was an unprovoked war. And I will quote Rabbi Kahn, who said, nonsense. It was in fact provoked. The very existence of a Jewish state in the Middle East for the Arabs is the provocation that they needed in order to try and destroy the state of Israel. And we need to recognize it for what it is. Our existence, the fact that there's a little Jewish girl playing with a ball on a Jewish playground anywhere in Eretz Israel is a provocation for the savages that did October 7th. And the moment that, and I want to tell you, none of the generals understand that. None of the generals understand that, which is the reason we, and this is terrible to say, aren't losing the war. It's the reason we lost the war.
Let me just add to that a little bit with some local information that here in Toronto, in the Toronto District School Board and other district school boards happening right now in Canada, you have Islamic groups that are putting pressure on the school boards to adopt what they call anti-Palestinian racism, and their definition in it, under the guise of fighting racism, the definition is that any student who comes to school or parent that supports Israel has a flag of Israel, anything to do with Israel, is racist.
Right.
Just like you said, the very existence of Israel, just like our rabbi said, the very existence of Israel
Is a provocative.
is a provocation to them.
That's right.
And therefore, left-wing leaders that we have, everything should be made, efforts should be made to make sure that they do not have any power over the Jewish community, whatever Jewish community, in Canada, the United States, Europe, in Israel. We need proper, focused Jewish leadership. That's what we need.
Yeah. We always end on a sour note. It's interesting. I always apologize for always, we're so, we're not pessimistic at all. I've always told people we're realistic. We're realistic. I wish I could do voice, as I say goodbye to you, I wish I could do voice, impersonations, because I would right now kick into Jill Biden's voice, and I would say to you, as my partner in this podcast today, Mayor, you were great. You knew all the facts. You were great, Mayor.
You were great too.
Anyhow, until next time, thank you so much, Mayor.
Thank you very much. We'll do it again. Thank you. Shalom, shalom. And whoever was watching with us, if you could please share this on whatever network you use on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, WhatsApp groups, we'd really appreciate it. Thank you very much for joining us, and we'll continue next week and the week after, and we'll get the information out there.
Thank you.
Shalom, shalom.
Before you click off, we had a lot of people watching, all over cyberspace, but there was one very important message of all the messages. I'm just going to play one because you'll all get it. It's very important. And here it is.
Well, yes.
You ready for it?
Yes.
There we go. I totally agree with Dr. B. Okay, so that's the only message that's really important tonight. Everything else was actually quite, being all serious now for a moment, get away with that. I see Mayor Jalowitz is liking it, but there were a lot of people not only watching, but interacting. And anybody who's watching now on Twitter, on YouTube, on Facebook, please do interact. This is supposed to be a live interactive session. So the next one it's on, please find a way to answers. And I think also that you guys answered all their questions. I think that's great to know. Certainly in agreement with everything we're saying is that evil must be destroyed. And we know that the Arabs don't want peace with Israel. So the answer by Starhopper is, as Mayor Kahane said, just get them out of there, okay? And some of the comments are paragraphs long, but basically they're all kind of echoing what you guys have said and here's a short one, which I think is important, is allowing Hamas to govern Gaza is abhorrent. Right, we can't, again, because they told us they're going to do this again and again. So, that's the bottom line. I'm not going to put on these very long ones, but I have been commenting to them. I'm going to click off. You guys make your last comments, and we'll see you all soon.
Mayor, we'll do it again. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.